Hi everyone. Today's lecture is our final lecture on translating. Next week we will turn to the semantics of our deductive logic. But today I will present to you a sophisticated method for translating sentences of ordinary language into sentences of deductive logic. So last week, when I introduced translation, I presented a simple two-step method for doing translations. This simple method was just that first, you translate the basic sentences that are within the sentence you're translating. So sentences like John is happy, or John is sad, or Mary is happy, etc. So the first thing you do, according to this simple method, is you translate the basic sentences that show up in the sentence you're translating. And then second, you translate the connectives. But now today, I will present to you a more detailed method. This has 8 steps as opposed to just 2. And this is a more detailed method for translation, and it helps with very complex sentences. So I'll give you the method, the abstract method to begin with, and then we will apply it to 1 or 2 cases in this lecture. So here is at an abstract level how the method works. And we have a number of steps with instructions in each step. So we begin the method when we have an ordinary language sentence that we're trying to translate. So the first step is we have to create a translation manual. So in order to do that, you have to identify all of the simple sentences within the sentence you're translating and assign to each of them a sentence letter. And that assignment of sentence letters from the vocabulary of our deductive logic, the assignment of those sentence letters to basic sentences is a translation manual. The second step is that you identify all of the connectives and you note the standard and the non-standard ones. Now, what it means for a connective to be standard is for it to clearly correspond to the connectives of our formal logic. So for instance, the word and clearly corresponds to the conjunction symbol. So the connective, English connective and is standard. However, the English word but or moreover, so those two words, but, moreover, those are non-standard because those do correspond to the conjunction, but not in an obvious way. Another example of a non-standard connective is the word unless. So as we've seen, that can be understood as corresponding to the disjunction. However, it's not obvious that the word unless corresponds to that connective. So it's another example of a non-standard connective. So in the first 2 steps, what we do is we identify the simple sentences and assign them sentence letters. The second thing is you identify all the connectives in the sentence you're going to translate, and you note which ones are standard and which ones are non-standard. That is, you note which ones are difficult to translate, the non-standard ones, and which ones are simple to translate, or easy to translate, which are the standard ones. Okay. Now, step 3, you translate all the simple English sentences within the sentence into their atomic counterparts. Given the translation manual that you have created. So this step 3 is kind of the first step of the simple method of translating the basic sentences. So in the step 3, you apply your translation manual and replace the simple sentences in the English sentence with their atomic sentence letter counterparts. After doing that, you then look at the sentence in step 4 and you identify the major connective. The major connective is the connective with the highest scope. So again, the notion of scope is very important, and we talked about it last week, and we had some exercises this week. So in step 4, you have to be able to identify what is the main connective of the sentence you're translating. Then in step 5, if the major connective is standard, then you simply symbolize it in this simple way. Because if the connective is standard, then the symbolization is obvious. But if the major connective is not standard, then you have to paraphrase it into a standard one, and then go back to step 4, which is that you identify the major connective. Now, of course, it should be easy to identify the major connective because you already have, and you paraphrased it, and then so you go to step 5. The major connective is standard, so you simply symbolize it. So summarizing step 4 and 5 again, what you do after you've translated all the simple sentences within the sentence you're translating, you then identify the major connective, and if it's standard, you symbolize it. If it's not standard, you paraphrase it and then symbolize it. So for instance, if the major connective is the word but, you can paraphrase that into the word and then translate the word and as the conjunction. So after you have symbolized the major connective, you move on to step 6, which is that once you know what the major connective is, you know what the constituent subformulas or subparts of the sentence are. And so what you do is you work on those subparts of the sentence separately. So you basically, once you have separated out the subparts of a sentence, you can translate those, translate the connectives that appear in those by themselves. And that's simpler than looking at the overall sentence. And then after you've fully symbolized all the constituent sentences, you then plug those symbolizations in to the overall sentence which you have from step 3. And once you've done that, you should have the entire sentence symbolized. And in step 8, once you have the entire sentence symbolized, you can translate the formula back into English and then compare what you have with the original statement. And what the new thing you have should capture in a more direct way what the meaning of the original statement was. So let us look at some examples of applying this method. So the main example we'll work through is as follows. The sentence is, John will pass unless he goofs off, provided that he is intelligent. So this sentence is a bit complicated. It's not immediately obvious how to translate this into a sentence of our propositional logic. So we're going to be applying this method to translating it. So we're going to be working through the translation process step by step. So the first step we do is we create a translation manual. So what we do for this step is we identify the atomic sentences and we assign them sentence letters. So one atomic sentence is that John is intelligent. So in interpreting the sentence, you have to realize that the word he, the pronoun he, is referring back to John. So one atomic sentence here is John is intelligent, and we give that I. Another is that John will pass, or John passes, and we assign that P. And the third and final atomic sentence, or simple sentence, is that John goofs off. And here again, we have to understand that he is talking about John. So the sentence he goofs off, we write that more perspicuously as John goofs off, and we assign it the letter G. So hopefully you can see how these 3 simple sentences are the 3 simple sentences that appear in this overall complex English sentence that we're translating. So the first step of creating a translation manual has been done. Now the second step is that we have to identify all of the connectives that appear in this complex sentence A1. So I'll give you a second to look at this sentence A1 and try for yourself to think about what are the connectives. Now the answer is that there's 2 connectives. One is the word unless, and the other is the word provided. So there's only two connectives in this sentence. And again, one is unless, and the other is provided, or provided that. Okay. And then furthermore, for step 2, we have to identify whether these connectives are standard or not. And what that means is that whether they simply correspond to connectives of our formal logic or not. And we see that both of these connectives are non-standard. It's not obvious which of the connectives of our formal language they correspond to. And that's the main reason I think that this sentence is difficult to translate, because we have this word unless and provided that, which is not obvious how to translate into our formal language. So in the second step, what we've done is we identify the connectives and whether or not they are standard or non-standard. Then in the third step, what we do is we go through this sentence, the whole sentence, and we replace the simple sentences with the sentence letters of our translation manual. And what we get is this: P unless G, provided that I. So here we have a partial translation where the simple sentences are replaced with atomic sentence letters, but we do not try to translate any of the connectives yet. Now, the fourth step is that we want to look at what we have in step 3, and we have to figure out which of these two connectives is the major one. Which of these two connectives has the highest scope? So take a moment to reflect on what the answer to that is. So here's a sentence again, and what the answer to which connective has the highest scope is that the connective provided that is the one with highest scope. So in order to see that intuitively, I want you to read this sentence again, which is that P unless G, provided that I. So this whole thing, what this sentence is saying is that P unless G is true, provided that I is true. So the major connective here is provided that. This sentence is not saying P unless G provided that I. So the comma here really helps us understand that the provided that is the main connective. And what you're saying is that P unless G is true, provided that I. And you're not saying that P is true unless G provided that I is true. So that latter interpretation is incorrect. The former one, however, which makes the provided that the main connective, is clearly the correct translation and the correct understanding of the relative scope of the two connectives. And if you look again at what exactly the sentence is saying, that also helps us. So what we're saying is that John will pass unless he goofs off. But that whole thing, i.e. John will pass unless he goofs off, that whole claim holds provided that he is intelligent. So the provided that is the main connective of the sentence. And so what we do in step 5, after we've identified the major connective, is we have to paraphrase it. And because provided that is not a standard connective, we have to paraphrase it into a standard one. And now the way to interpret what it means to say that John will pass unless he goofs off, provided he is intelligent, is the way we paraphrase that into a conditional. So what it means is that if John is intelligent, then John will pass unless he goofs off. So we paraphrase what we have from step 3 here, P unless G, provided that I. We paraphrase that into if I, then P unless G. All right, and then we have to symbolize what we have here, this paraphrase, and we simply do that with the conditional or the right arrow. Okay, so we've seen in step 4, when we look at what we have in step 5, we realize that the if-then is standard, so we're able to simply translate that. And what we translate if-then as is with the right arrow. So to say if I, then P unless G is to say that I arrow P unless G. So now we've completed step 5 and we've symbolized the main connective. And it was a bit difficult because the main connective provided that is non-standard. But once we see that provided that, we really just can be paraphrased into a conditional. And then once we make that paraphrase, we can then translate the conditional into a symbol of our logic. So we're now at the point where the sentence we started at, which is that John will pass unless he goofs off, provided that he is intelligent. That sentence we have if I, then P unless G. Now, step 6 is we're going to work on the constituent formulas separately. So for this conditional, there's two constituent formulas. There is the antecedent I and the consequent P unless G. Now I is already fully formalized because it's very simple, it's just a single sentence letter. So now what's left for us to do is we have to translate P unless G. So we're going to translate P unless G by itself, and then we're going to plug it in to what we have here for step 5. So the way we translate P unless G is just simply with a disjunction. So to say that P unless G, we capture by just simply saying P or G. And this was something I talked about in the lecture from Monday. And I think there's already been at least one multiple choice question about it. But hopefully you can see how to say that John will pass unless he goofs off. We can understand that as saying John will pass or he will goof off. Now, another way of putting that is that if John doesn't pass, then he goofs off. So we can use, instead of a single disjunction, we can use a negation and the conditional. But that is a bit more complicated than just simply using the disjunction. So what we do is we capture the claim that John will pass unless he goofs off. We capture that with simply the disjunction, either John passes or he goofs off. Then we simply plug our translation of the consequent, P unless G, into our result from step 5. So now we have a fully translated sentence, I arrow P or G. So our final step, step 8, is that we translate this back directly into English. And what we get is that if John is intelligent, then he will pass or he will goof off. And so we compare what we have here to our original sentence, which is that John will pass unless he goofs off, provided that he is intelligent. And hopefully upon some reflection, you can see how what we have in step 8 has basically the same meaning as what we started with. If anything, it's a bit more clear and logical in a sense. And that's how we know that the translation we've ended up with in step 7 here is the correct translation. And we arrived at that through applying this 8-step method. And this is from the reading for this week, the chapter on logic from Heidegger. So that's why I've called it Heidegger's method. And in the reading, you can see this broken down as well, and you can refer back to the method from the PDF reading. Okay, now to finish off this lecture, let me apply this method to one more example. And I want to note that in the reading for this week from Heidegger chapter 4, at the end of the reading, he gives many exercises of sentences for you to translate. So I highly recommend that you take some time to actually try translating yourself some of these sentences. And furthermore, Heidegger also provides the answers. So what you can do is you can attempt them yourself and then check your result with the answers he gives to see whether you've gotten it correctly. But also you should feel totally free to come to the office hours as well with any questions or issues you have while working through these examples, and we can work through many other examples together. But what I'll do to conclude this lecture is I'm just going to work through one of these examples, and it's this one here. So both J and K will go to the beach this weekend, provided that neither of them is sick. So to return, the first step is we're going to create a translation manual for all the basic sentences, and that sentence I just read. Then we'll identify the connectives, noting which ones are standard or not. Then we'll translate all of the basic simple English sentences following the translation manual. Then we'll identify and translate the major connective. Then we'll work on the constituent formulas, and then we'll plug those into our result from earlier. And then once we have our final translated sentence, we'll read it back into English to see how it compares with the one we started with, which is that both J and K will go to the beach this weekend, provided that neither of them is sick. So let me switch to my other screen. Before doing so, I want to note that there are 4 basic sentences that are parts of this sentence here. The first is that J will go to the beach this weekend. The second is that K will go to the beach this weekend. And then in order to understand that neither of them is sick, you have to understand that there's 2 basic sentences here. One of them is that J is sick, and the other one is that K is sick. Okay, so let me switch. Now hopefully my technology works smoothly. All right, so B1 is going to mean that J, and I'm going to abbreviate this. The letter B1 with a subscript 1, so B1 will mean that J will go to the beach. Now B2 will mean that K goes to the beach. Now S1 will mean that J is sick. S2 will mean that K is sick. So I'm going to erase this in a moment when we start the other steps, but I want you to keep this in the back of your mind, and this is our translation manual for the first step. So B1 means that J is going to the beach, B2 means that K is going to the beach, then S1 means that J is sick, and S2 means that K is sick. So now the second step is we want to identify all of the connectives in this sentence. So the first one is we see this word and. So here we have a connective. And then the second one is that we have provided that, like in the example from earlier. And third, we have neither. So these are the 3 connectives which are making up our sentence. Now we want to identify which one of them these are standard or not. Now the first one, and, is standard, so we should also include the word both. So both J and K will go to the beach this weekend includes the standard connective of conjunction. And these other 2, provided that and neither, they are non-standard. So we've just completed step 2, which is to identify all the connectives, noting whether they are standard or non-standard. Now the third step is that we want to translate all the simple English sentences into atomic sentences given the translation manual. Okay, so let me return to the other screen and we'll start actually doing the translation. So we want to retain the English words for these connectives while translating the simple sentences. So this should be S. So here we have both B1 and B2, provided that neither S1 and S2. So you might see that in translating this last part, provided that neither of them is sick, I've cheated a little bit and it doesn't make sense for us to write. So here we have neither of them is sick, and I wrote S1, neither S1 and S2, but it might be more natural for us to write S1 nor S2. So you had to kind of insert this nor thing to make sense of this, but hopefully you can see how when we start to try to understand what it means to say that neither of them is sick, what we're saying is that neither J is sick nor K is sick. Okay, so that is the way in which I've completed the step 3, which involves translating all the simple sentences while retaining the English words for the connectives. Okay, now we're on to the 4th step, which is that we want to identify the major connective and then make sure it's standard. And if it's not, we translate it, or we paraphrase it into a standard one. And then we translate it into a formal connective. So looking at this sentence, think which of the connectives we identified is the main one. The answer to this is that the main connective is, again, provided that. So the main claim this sentence is saying is that both J and K will go to the beach, provided that neither of them is sick. So this provided that is really the central connective of this entire sentence. But similarly as with above, provided that is not a standard connective. And what we have to do is we have to translate it into a conditional. So, or a paraphrase. So the paraphrase of this sentence, where we turn provided that into a standard connective, is as follows. If neither J nor K are sick, then both J and K will go to the beach this weekend. So let me repeat that to you. The paraphrase of this sentence, paraphrasing provided that into a standard connective, is if neither J nor K is sick, then both J and K will go to the beach this weekend. And then when we want to translate that if then connective into our formal logic, what we have is as follows. Let me write this out. We have so here we have the conditional and the antecedent of the conditional is that neither S1 nor S2. And the consequent is that both B1 and B2. So now the final steps of our method is that we're going to work on the antecedent and the consequent individually. So we're going to translate neither S1 nor S2. And then we're going to translate fully both B1 and B2. And then we're going to plug in those translations into what we have here. So let's do that. So let me erase this. All right, so let's begin with the consequent, which is very simple. So the sentence, the constituent or the consequent of this entire conditional, both B1 and B2, that's simply translated as B1 and B2. So that corresponds to the consequent. Now, with neither S1 nor S2, you can think of that like as if it's saying not either S1 or S2, which is like saying, which can be translated as not S1 or S2. And as we talked about on the lecture from Monday, this is also equivalent to not S1 and not S2. Then when we turn to semantics, we'll see more clearly why these two things are equivalent. But in any case, I'll use the translation here where we have not S1 and not S2, and that is how we translate the antecedent of this conditional. So what we have is that not S1 and not S2, then B1 and B2. So let me erase this and start over, and I'll write out what all of this. I'll write out the actual formula which we have here when we substitute this one here for the antecedent and this one here for the consequent. So we have not S1 and not S2. So if that, then B1 and B2. So here is what we have arrived at as our final translation. If not S1 and not S2, then B1 and B2. So now we translate that back to English following our translation manual, and what we have is that the following. If J isn't sick and K isn't sick, then J will go to the beach and K will go to the beach. So another way of putting that is simply that if J and K are both healthy, then they'll both go to the beach. Now let me go back to the original sentence. So the original sentence was that both J and K will go to the beach this weekend, provided that neither of them is sick. And if we look at the translation we have and translate that back into English, what we have again is that if J isn't sick and K isn't sick, then J will go to the beach this weekend and K will go to the beach this weekend. And hopefully you can see how this here is a good translation, a correct translation of this sentence here. Okay, so good luck to everyone with any of the translations you try yourself, as well as the questions, the multiple choice questions for this week. And next week we will turn to the semantics.